board reports and questions about what's happening in cybersecurity. You need to do something in cybersecurity. But what a lot of those organizations and folks are failing to do is help you figure out where you actually need to start for your organization and figure out the right solution for your organization. So my goal today is to give you some ideas on starting places, some of the ways Lockstep approaches it, some of the ways that can help you approach cybersecurity, and ultimately help you make relatively straight progress toward increasing your cyber maturity. Before we jump into the overarching content, right, and the specifics, I wanted to highlight Lockstep Technology Group as a whole to start off, because I understand there's a couple folks that I don't recognize on the attendee list today. So Lockstep Technology Group is a value-added technology reseller as well as service provider. And we provide services across the entire spectrum of what we call connect, protect, empower for our customers, our clients, right? So that's everything from networking to surveillance, laptops, devices, all the way into physical, and then ultimately cybersecurity, which is what we're here to talk about today. So a little bit about me, right? Sean mentioned I'm VP of Cybersecurity Services over here at Lockstep Technology Group. I've been in cybersecurity and IT for a little over 15 years now. I have a handful of certifications. You see a couple of them up here on the slide. And then I also have an amazing wife and a daughter who helps keep me quite humble, if I may say. Jumping into the actual content, right? I like to start all of my presentations off with a little bit of a baseline and talk about what is cyber maturity. I understand that there's some folks that have been in cyber a little bit longer than others, some that aren't quite in cyber, but maybe indirectly related. So I really want to start off with a quick definition of cyber maturity and what it means and what we're trying to accomplish ultimately. And then spend the bulk of the presentation talking about that second bullet point, right? How do you evaluate your cyber maturity? What are some of the different ways? And what does that process even look like? So jumping into that first part, what is cyber maturity? So depending on who you ask and which source you go to look at, there's a variety of definitions. But what I found as I was preparing for this presentation is that bringing together those definitions, they all had similar thoughts, right? Similar processes. And so if you look at that first sentence, the key word there, cyber threats, an organization is prepared, all those kind of good things. The key word to me is handle, right? So handle cyber threats doesn't just mean prevent, detect, respond, or recover. It means all of them. And so if you think about the maturity or just the progress of cybersecurity in enterprises and in organizations over the years, we originally started with prevention. Build bigger firewalls, build bigger moats. And that was kind of the approach, right? Keep everybody out of the castle, so to speak. But once you were in the castle, you were kind of free to roam about. And then what we saw was an evolution from prevention or just prevention to prevention is ideal, but detection is a must. Right? You heard of things like defense in depth or assumed breach approach and all these different things. And so that really focused on the prevention and then ultimately detection from a cybersecurity standpoint. And then kind of getting a little bit more recent in the last 5 or so years, maybe a little bit less than that, you've seen this move from prevention is ideal, detection is great, but we have to be cyber resilient, right? We know that cyber incidents are going to happen. Cyber attacks are going to happen. We'd love to stop all of them. But with the evolution of cyber threats and our businesses, it's very hard to stop every single cyber threat. So ultimately, we're eventually going to miss a prevention. We're going to detect something, but we also have to be able to respond and recover to those attacks. And so you see much more of a shift to cyber resiliency. And so that's what brings us here today. So now that we have a quick definition of cyber maturity, why is it important? And so like any cyber presentation these days, right, I have the obligatory headline slide, right? This is probably not new news to any of you, but regardless of your industry, regardless of the size of your organization, everyone at some way, shape, or form has been a victim or is a target for a cyber attack. And so from a cyber maturity standpoint, right, you're seeing a lot of organizations originally focused on the confidentiality of data, but now more than ever, we're also concerned with the availability of data, systems, and networks more than ever before. So ideally, we keep our health patients' data secure, but we have to have computers, we have to have networks, we have to have the adjacent systems in a hospital to ultimately continue to provide patient care. And so you're seeing this shift from purely the confidentiality of data into the availability of both data systems, networks, cloud infrastructure, whatever your respective organization uses. And so without technology, a lot of organizations aren't prepared to continue their respective mission. So in the school system, they're not prepared to continue to deliver teaching or pay teachers or any of the other technology-enabled functions. Same thing in construction, you're not prepared to do some of your, while your business may be physically building something, technology enables all the back-end work that typically happens in those scenarios. And so technology is at the forefront of every single thing we do. And how do you do your job whenever you don't have a computer, whenever you can't pay people? What does that process look like? And so for a lot of organizations, that's kind of what leads to their downfall from a cybersecurity standpoint. And I think these headlines aren't new news to probably anyone on this call, right? We've all heard of breaches, massive breaches, small breaches, takedowns of networks, some organizations even going out of business as a result of a cyber attack. But why aren't we improving? This isn't new news to anyone. And so, not that this is the only reason, but I thought this slide did a good job of representing it. This slide's a few years old from a company called Momentum. But ultimately, it shows the wide array of technology and service providers that existed a handful of years ago. And this by no means is an effort to kind of highlight any of these. I don't plan on talking about any specific vendors. But there's so much information, and all of these technologies and service providers are good at what they do. Some of them are even great at what they do, but they may not be the right solution for your organization, or they may not be the right solution for your organization right now. So it's about applying the right solutions at the right time for the right organization. And so how do you figure that piece out? And that leads us to this evaluation process. So here at Lockstep, we follow this 5-step process starting over here in this top right. Assessing, designing, implementation, manage, and evolve. That's the process we follow. It leads to success for us and our clients. And if you have a similar process, that can be fine. It doesn't mean that one process is better than the other. It's just important that you have a process. And so we're going to step through each one of these, talk a little bit about them and how they relate, and just kind of go from there and talk about how they can apply in your environment. So jumping off in the assessment phase first, right? Assessing your environment. And so for each one of these, we're going to have a purpose and a desired outcome. So assessments are to identify security postures, risks, vulnerabilities, right? But the big thing is strengths and weaknesses, right? So highlight your strengths, but also highlight your weaknesses. And one of the downfalls I see for organizations that do assessments or audits or some variety of that is they want to appear good because they want to show their bosses or their respective team members how great they are as a team. But what they fail to do often is use that as an opportunity to be open and truthful so that they can actually make tangible progress to being good instead of just purely looking good. And so from an assessment standpoint, lots of organizations have different types of assessments, and choosing the right assessment relies on a variety of factors, right? Some folks do assessments every year, every couple years, every 3 years, depending on the organization and their rate of progress. Some folks do it as a result of an emerging threat, whether it be a specific email attack or a specific incident or threat vector. Other folks do assessments based on compliance or regulatory requirements, or maybe cyber insurance. We're going to talk about that one again here in a minute. And then strategic planning and aging technology. So if you know that you have an old technology stack, figuring out what the right technology stack, right, and assessment may be the right place for you. And then the last factor is budget. So do you have the internal capability to do an assessment? And if not, what does your budget look like from an external perspective so that you can get the assessment that's going to provide the most value to you? And in some scenarios, that's going to say, take your limited budget, spend less of that on the assessment itself, and spend more of it on the actual remediations. Because I don't know about any of y'all, but I don't know too many organizations that need to add to their list of work to do. They really need help benefiting and making actual progress. And so I'm going to highlight a couple of our assessments, I think 2 or 3 of our assessments, and talk about who they may be a right fit for. But understanding that answering this question, right, choosing the right assessment and why you're even interested in an assessment, that's going to help you determine the right assessment for you. Once again, similar to that technology slide earlier, there are lots of assessments and most of them are great, but it's about finding the one that's right for your organization at the right time. And so starting off with one of our assessments called the Foundational Security Assessment, the FSA. It's really, as the name implies, right? It's for foundational needs. So folks or organizations that are a little bit lower maturity or maybe high maturity, but they haven't looked at their Active Directory configuration or their vulnerabilities recently. The Foundational Security Assessment was really developed by us as a result of years of penetration testing. So we'd have clients engage us to do a penetration test, and we'd find the same vulnerabilities and take advantage of the same misconfigurations, test over test over test. And the attackers are doing the same thing. So instead of providing a more expensive penetration test, what we did is we developed a defensive version of that looks for all the things that we look for on a standard penetration test, but we save money for the client because ultimately we don't have to prove exploitability, and we can just look for those misconfigurations ahead of time. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a cyber attack today that didn't take advantage of Active Directory in some way, shape, or form. And most folks' Active Directory has been around since the inception of their network, 15, 20, 25 years ago, whatever it was. But most folks never take a look at the actual configurations or misconfigurations, or there's a lack of hardening around it. And so that's our foundational security assessment. And so as you move from that, right, if you're that lower maturity organization or the organization that hasn't quite looked at their vulnerabilities or hasn't looked at Active Directory from a configuration standpoint recently, something like a foundational security assessment may be the right assessment for you. And then going into the second assessment is the cyber insurance assessment. So our cyber insurance assessment was born out of working with our various clients and figuring out what was being asked most often by cyber insurance providers. And so we created two broad buckets here called required controls and remaining controls. And so if cyber insurance is one of your biggest concerns as an organization, or you're failing to renew it or having a hard time renewing it or finding a provider that'll provide cyber insurance in the first place, looking at something like an assessment geared around cyber insurance may be the right solution. And so as you look at something like I've called it required controls up here, also caveat, this isn't true for every single cyber insurance provider, but broadly it seems to hold true as you work with the different providers. But things like multi-factor authentication, things like EDR, things like secure, encrypted, and tested backups, all of those things in the top category tend to be the things that either disqualify you or qualify you for cyber insurance as a whole. Now, having those top 5 things doesn't mean you're going to like your premium whenever you do get quoted cyber insurance, but it will mean that you have a better likelihood of getting quoted cyber insurance in the first place. And so as you look at those bottom 7 categories or remaining controls bucket, that's really the category of controls that will typically help drive your premium down. So it'll help you save money and ideally offset some of the cost of the solutions in that space. But ultimately, if you're struggling with cyber insurance or seem to be on the reactive side of cyber insurance regularly, having an assessment like this, a proactive assessment, helps you put on the offense and helps you tell a good story to your respective broker. And the third assessment that I want to touch on briefly is our zero trust architecture assessment. So I think you'd have a hard time today finding a technology provider that was not selling something that was tied to zero trust in some way, shape, or form. But what a lot of those technology providers are failing to tell you is that you likely have technology in place today that can help you on your zero trust journey, right? So zero trust isn't a single technology or even a suite of technologies, right? It's an entire approach to securing your network and leading with zero trust, or as I like to call it, explicit trust in mind. So there's 2 different ways to assess an environment from a zero trust standpoint. The first is from a technology standpoint. Where do you currently lie in your technology stack, and do you have the capabilities to be closer to a zero trust environment? And the second piece is your implementation. Lots of folks have technologies that are helpful or that are capable of being more zero trust or being closer to a zero trust model, but maybe their maturity and their implementation of those technologies today isn't quite there. And so if you're dealing with aging equipment, or you're looking at a network refresh, or you're looking at a on-prem to cloud migration or some version of that, something like a holistic approach to Zero Trust may be a good fit for you, just from a perspective of securing your network and securing it for the future, not just for the right now. And one of the main things that we're focused on here is purely identifying where you're at and where you want to go. We're not creating solutions. We're not designing solutions yet. We're purely figuring out where you're at and where you want to go. And then we'll worry about developing the solutions down the road. We'll talk about that here in a second. But this will help provide the structure for you to help create your roadmap and be more on the proactive side of cybersecurity instead of being reactive to all the respective threats or questions that come across. And so as we talk about the actual design, right? Now we're starting to talk about the actual developing of solutions. We've identified gaps. We've found where we're at. We've figured out where we want to go. Now we need to address gaps. And so this is still in the planning side of developing the strategy to address the gaps. We're still not buying technology. We're still not shopping for technology. We're not looking for service providers. We're not looking for the technology we currently have. We're hyper focused on identifying solutions to the gaps that we identified in the previous step. And so from that, you ultimately start the process of creating your roadmap, right? So in the Zero Trust architecture assessment, maybe you need to do something around centralized logging, or maybe you need to figure out a monitoring plan to address threats or some type of threat intelligence program. Ultimately, having something like this will help you develop a roadmap. Maybe you change the colors up, but ultimately it will help you develop a roadmap and a project plan or a Gantt chart if you love your project management tools. It will help you develop a roadmap so that you can stay on course and continuously make progress in your cybersecurity journey. So a lot of folks get distracted by the latest news cycle, or AI did this, or quantum computing is going to break encryption, or all these other things. And they get so caught up in all the things that are happening, all the news articles, all the hype cycles, that it pauses them from actually making progress on their respective solution. And as I think about these first two steps, I think about something that a previous manager of mine used to tell me years ago, that I'll be honest, I don't know that I fully appreciated whenever he told me at the time, but I think holds true and makes a lot more sense to me now than it did back then. But a problem well-defined is half solved. And so as you think about this, the bulk of the work in creating a roadmap and making improvements in your cyber maturity is really around accurately assessing your gaps and defining your problem and starting to work on your solutions. So as you're defining the problem and breaking down the gaps that you have, breaking them down into specific scenarios or specific gaps helps be more clear and develop the right solution. So I don't know how many folks, how many incidents we've worked where organizations said something like, oh yeah, I'm in the process of implementing MFA or some version of that. Because ultimately, whenever you go to implement a solution, whether it be MFA or a SIM solution or an EDR, regardless of what it is, there's going to be some gotcha, some catch up, some user base that doesn't want to do MFA, some user base that doesn't want to use their personal cell phone to do text message based MFA, right? There's going to be some hiccup in any implementation. And it's really about understanding the problem and not letting that stop your future progress. And so if you do these first two steps well, the rest of the steps will be incredibly easy as it compares to the first two steps, right? Spend your time documenting, spend your time identifying the true problem and starting to design solutions respective for your environment. And so as we move on to this third phase and we move on to the implementation side, we've now identified our gaps, we've designed solutions, we've started to prioritize which solutions to put into place before the others. And so now it's time to start to put those design plans into action, right? With the ideal outcome that we ultimately increase your cyber maturity, maybe from a 2 to a 3 in the Zero Trust scenario, or a 2 to a 2.5, depends on the specific solution and the analysis. And as I think about implementation of a solution, I really break that down into kind of 3 broad categories. Identifying key milestones and criteria, communicating to the team, and then ultimately execution. So at this point, we've documented the gap, we've documented the solution. It's time to actually do the work. And so as you look at key milestones, you need to break down an overarching project, whether it's implementing MFA or an EDR or a SIM or changing a configuration. You need to break down any broad sweeping project into specific milestones with dates, allocation of resources, and then ultimately success criteria. What I've seen too often is folks that start that get an assessment done and they start all the remediations right away. And if you start 15 different remediations right away, you're unlikely to get finished with a single one because you just got started 15 different efforts and there's no real prioritization of effort or communication or work cycle or true success criteria. And so if you have milestones and key dates, but you don't allocate resources, first off, you're not going to make very good progress because no one's working on the project. But if you allocate resources and don't set key dates for your milestones, you're unlikely to get prioritization. So in my mind, I think you need all four of these to actually make progress on the remediations that are identified in that first step. The second piece that I like to talk about is communication to the team. So typically, whenever you have an assessment done or you need to go out and do something or spin up some type of project, you have to go ask some manager or even yourself as a manager, you have to prioritize resources. You have to maybe ask for budget. You need to maybe ask for a champion or get champions in an organization. And so what happens typically is you get those resources, you get the budget, you get whatever it is you needed to close the gap. And then that person, that senior manager, that SVP, whoever it is, they never hear from you again until you need something else. And so one of the things I like to do here is as I'm progressing with a project or meeting my success criteria or even wrapping up a project, I like to circle back with that stakeholder that gave me their support and make sure they're up to date on the challenges we face, the success we have, and the outcome. If I told them that if you give me ABC budget, I'm going to deliver XYZ, I want to circle back and let them know that I delivered XYZ so that they're not only hearing from me whenever I need more money or I need something from them. The other parts I think are probably a little bit more obvious in that you need to communicate to your internal IT teams, technical teams, and then ultimately your end users. So you don't want end users to be caught off guard with an implementation of MFA or some new content blocking policy or anything like that, right? You want to proactively communicate to your end users as well. As a security professional, I think one of the worst things we can have is creative users. We don't want our users to find creative solutions to bypassing our security controls. And so what we want to do is proactively communicate, proactively work with our end users so that we're not putting roadblocks in their day. Because if we're putting too many roadblocks in their day for them to get their job done, they're going to find creative solutions, and creative solutions often bypass security controls. So make sure you're working, not only communicating, but collaborating with your end users. The last piece on the implementation side is really execution. So I have a few things highlighted. Could be implement the solution, could be adhering to timelines, but ultimately the overarching goal here is to do the job. You did your gap analysis, you identified solutions. Now it's time to do the work, right? This should be the relatively easy part if you did the first two steps well. If you didn't do the first two steps well, this is going to be a little bit difficult. I'll be honest. But if you did the prior steps well, this part will be much easier than it would have been otherwise. And so as we transition from assessing your environment, assessing the solutions you have in place today, to designing solutions, we've implemented solutions. So if there's a technology, we finished the implementation. It's important to transition from the end of a project and then the start of the maintenance or the management of that respective solution or the configuration change or whatever it was. And so this is really where you shift from not only like the project has been implemented, but this is the tuning, this is the documentation, this is the monitoring alerts, this is the terrible ChatGPT generated picture over on the right-hand side, right? But this is the actual monitoring. So in the EDR example, in the endpoint detection and response example, let's say we implemented EDR, we implement the technology. It's one thing to implement a technology, it's another thing to be able to monitor it and manage it effectively. So often in incidents, what I found is organizations actually had alerts prior to being impacted by a cyber threat, but they didn't figure out this management piece. They didn't figure out this monitoring piece. And so no one was looking at the alerts. Or people were looking at the alerts, but they didn't understand the alert. And so both of those pieces are important. And so as you look to buy technologies or implement a solution or change a configuration on a solution, the first part is designing the solution and figuring out how you're going to implement it or what you're going to change in your communication plan. But it's also after you've installed the solution or after you've implemented it, what are you going to do after that? What are you going to do to document the process to make sure in a couple of years someone doesn't come behind you and rip it out because they don't understand it or they don't understand the implementation or why you went left at an intersection instead of went right? And so this is really around documentation and fine-tuning the respective technology. And so as you're doing it, it's important to shift from one step to the next and have success criteria on each one. And then the last step that I wanted to talk about today is really the evolution. So in the EDR example, where you've implemented an EDR or MFA or any of these other solutions, or maybe you had to develop an incident response plan, you need to come back around and test that you actually closed whatever gap it is you originally identified. So if it was, you didn't have an incident response plan, maybe you need to do something like a tabletop exercise. Or maybe you had to do something around network segmentation or hardening or disabling legacy protocols. Maybe you need to do something like a penetration test. And so following on this journey on going around the wheel and moving over to evolution is really around testing the controls that you implemented to ensure that they close the gap that you originally thought they were going to close. And so moving on, you need to prioritize your areas of improvement. You need to go deeper in the respective solution. So maybe you bought a technology to close gap A, but it can also close B and C, right? So evaluate it, evolve the solution, and make meaningful progress and incremental progress toward hardening and increasing your overall cyber maturity. And so like I mentioned earlier, right? Let's say you're missing an incident response plan or you've never tested your incident response plan. One of the things that you may want to do is something like a tabletop exercise. So a tabletop exercise is where you get all the relevant stakeholders in the room and you run through an incident like it's happening live, but in somewhat of a safe space in a conference room like the one I'm standing in right now. And so what you typically find in a tabletop exercise, or what I found personally, is that folks end up sitting across the table from each other and either not knowing what they're supposed to do or thinking it's someone else's responsibility. And so a tabletop exercise is a place where you can actually get together and understand everybody's roles and responsibilities in an incident, not at necessarily a technical level, but from a public relations level, from a legal level, from all the different levels, and really figure out how the team is going to work together before they're actually put in that respective situation. In a cyber incident scenario, while it is an IT problem early on, what it ends up happening is it's much less of an IT problem, and it ends up being much more of a business or revenue operations or PR, legal, right? So it's important to get those people involved early because they may not realize that that's an issue for them or that that's their problem. What I find often is that those folks think it's an IT problem, but whenever they're hit with it, they're unsure of what to do. They've never drafted a communications plan for a cyber incident, or they don't know if they want to negotiate with the ransom operator if they stole data, or they don't know when to engage cyber insurance or some of these other external functions or organizations. And so a tabletop exercise is a great example of how to test your incident response plan before you're actually hit with an incident. It's just like a game in sporting or anything else, right? Like you need to practice before you hit the game day and you're unsure of who's on first or what's on second. The last thing, in case I didn't touch on it earlier, is that this is a process. For better or worse, cybersecurity, you'll never reach a done state. You'll never implement a solution to say, okay, I'm good, I can go home now, right? It's an ongoing process. Just like your team, your organizational operations team is, right? They're never done. So in the K-12 example, your teachers are never done teaching, just like you're never done learning, just like your administrators are never done being administrators. Cybersecurity is a continuous journey. It's something that you have to do over and over again. You have to reassess your environment. You have to be able to tune your environment. And you have to develop roadmaps so that you don't get caught off guard by every shiny thing that happens. I've had multiple conversations over the last year or two talking about artificial intelligence and the way that it's going to shape cybersecurity and change cybersecurity. And so I've seen organizations basically stop making all other progress to go learn about artificial intelligence. They haven't implemented multi-factor authentication yet. You don't need to be worried about quantum computing breaking encryption. Like that's not where your concern is. You need to build your foundation up in hard and active directory, implement MFA on your ingress mechanisms, right? Whether that be VPN or Microsoft 365 or whatever it is. Just because there's a new shiny thing like deepfakes or quantum computing or artificial intelligence doesn't mean that you should completely steer off guard from your roadmap. And so having a roadmap helps you have a true north. It also helps you have a true north to come back to whenever you get random questions about AI or some of these other things. You can spend a day or two researching some of these more things that you didn't account for in your roadmap, and then come back to your true north and get back to the project, get back to the execution that you've already defined. And so I think I went through the material a little bit quick here, but ultimately, if you'd like to talk more, I have my email address there. Marketing was also nice enough to stand up a dedicated website there to learn more about some of our specific solutions and the way we approach it in a contact form. So you're more than welcome to reach out to me personally or reach out to your existing account representative. I guess I'll pause there for a second. Bria, do we have any questions?
The only question I see is someone asking if we can email the presentation after this.
Yeah, absolutely. We can follow up. Just reach out and we'll send over the presentation after this. And then if there's nothing else, I look forward to having conversations with some of y'all on the phone after this. I appreciate y'all time this afternoon.
Brett, are you there?
Yes, sir.
I actually do see one more question in there. What is your recommendation for talking to the C-suite about the need for higher cybersecurity budget without scaring them into thinking the sky is falling?
So there's lots of different ways. Personally, I like the tabletop exercises for precisely that reason. So you don't want to tell them that the sky is falling or be the person that's constantly pitching fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? What I would pitch instead is proactiveness. Cyber threats are real. It doesn't mean that you need to be afraid and stay up all hours of the night, but it does mean that you need to be proactive. Just like in your organization, depending on your organization, just like you look at headwinds and tailwinds from a market perspective, or just like you may look at, if you're a college, declining rates of admission, just like you take proactive approaches to those things, you need to take a proactive approach to something like this. And so that's a scenario where tabletop exercises are great because you can either facilitate it internally. What I honestly see better in that scenario is getting an external organization like Lockstep to provide a tabletop exercise, because sometimes external folks, for better or worse, help to get executives or leaders' attention a little bit more than internal folks a lot of the times. And so an external entity like Lockstep coming in and doing an assessment like that and doing a tabletop exercise can help steer that conversation to be a proactive conversation and not be purely fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I think another way is conferences. So there's conferences that specifically talk about cybersecurity and aren't all doom and gloom, but also help preach the proactiveness. So those are two of the top ways that I'd approach it. Sean, Bria, any other questions we're seeing in the chat right now?
I don't see any other questions, Brett.
Perfect. Marketing did want to put a QR code on here, but I was a naysayer. I figured it was a security presentation, and that was bad form. So I apologize. You do have to click on the link, or type in the link to go to the landing page. So blame it on the security guy for making life a little bit harder on you today. Cool. If nothing else, also worth mentioning, shameless plug, we have another webinar next week talking about, or next month, excuse me, talking about the cyber defense matrix, going to be given by one of my peers here at Lockstep, Andrew Sicoli. So that's also on that same link.
Brett, we did get one more comment. Someone who missed the beginning of the presentation and is asking if you can talk a little bit about using our services as a security audit.
So we kicked it off, and some of the beginning stuff we talked about really was assessing your environment and choosing the right assessment to help fuel your roadmap and your progress. So I mean, choosing the right assessment is really kind of vital for helping be that auditor, if you will, or assessment, if you will, to help build the roadmap and identify gaps and whatnot. So more than happy to reach out after this and kind of touch base on which assessment may make the most sense, if one at all.